Welcome to the Hope for the Animals podcast, a project of compassionate living. I'm your host, Hope Bohannic, and you can support this podcast with a donation by going to compassionate-living.org/donate. So today we're going to again be tackling an important issue in the vegan community, and that is anti-fat bias, how we treat and see and think about and feel about large bodied people. And I had Andy Tabar on the podcast a couple of years ago talking about this issue. So, I thought I knew a fair amount about it. But today we're going to be talking with Britty Mann of Planted Society. And she was so insightful about this issue. It's one of those issues, just the more you unpack, the more you learn, the more you realize how deep it goes and how much there is to it, how much there is to learn. And for me, how much more outraged I get the more I hear about this particular oppression. So, if you're interested in this issue and want to hear more, I encourage you to listen to Andy Tabar's episode that we did already. And I will put that episode, a link to that episode in the show notes. It was called Fat Justice and Veganism. So there's just so much to talk about and cover on this topic. We're just going to jump right in to the interview. I didn't want to cut a thing. I hope you enjoy it. All right, so today we have Britty Mann. She is the founder and executive director of Planted Society, a U.S. nonprofit that makes plant-based eating more accessible to ensure a better future for the planet and all living beings. With over 15 years of experience in supply chain and community advocacy, Britty believes that we all have the capacity to help change the global food system, starting by fostering relationships with our own bodies and enacting change in our local communities. Welcome to the podcast, Britty.
Thank you.
It's good to have you. And we like to start by getting to know you. And we want to start with the question about your vegan origin story. When and why did you go vegan?
So my story starts when I was in my early teenage years. I don't know, Hope, do you remember Yahoo chat rooms?
No, no, Yahoo was way before. That was the very first big one, wasn't it?
Yeah, so I'm a 90s kid, and it was really one of the first ventures out into the social media space. So
Yeah.
Yahoo.com had these siphoned off little chat rooms that you could join just as an anonymous person. And I remember frequenting those when I was a young teenager because, it was incredibly exciting at the time to be able to chat with whoever you wanted to. I would do so in the cover of darkness after my mom had gone to sleep mostly. And I used to frequent this one chat room that I think was just for teenagers. And so I would go on and just like have like innocent chats with people all over the place. We'd, talk about boring things, share funny videos. And I remember this one very already late evening, someone popped a link into the chat room, and I am incredibly tech savvy. And so I decided to click it without considering what was on the other end of this link. And I say that with irony. I was
Right.
a little kid who did not know what I was doing. And it was actually a link to a video on the PETA website, which I think you might know is generally not something that you would necessarily seek out on your own. So I won't go into the details, but it has to do with farming, and it was a pretty graphic video that is still stuck in my head to this day,
Oh,
stuck in my
wow.
head. But it kind of launched me into this, I guess, deep dive into everything else that was on the PETA website at the time. I'm not sure if PETA 2 was a thing yet, which was like
The
the youth
teen,
version.
yeah, youth. Right, right. Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so I watched video after video after video, this one dark night in the early 2000s, and I went vegan
Mm,
after that. It
wow.
was it was done for me. I was never a vegetarian. But I do think that I was probably pretty primed for this moment. I always really looked up to vegetarians. I was already very into being vegetarian in my head. I knew that eventually I wanted to become a vegetarian, just like people do now. I think people didn't even recognize that there was a step beyond being a vegetarian. And so that was really the end all be all of cool people for me. I tried really hard to go vegetarian when I was a kid. I would get distracted by being a kid and never really had a good enough reason to keep going back to it. But this was like an out for me. I was like, I'm ready for this. This is crazy. Later in my life, when I tell this story to other people, they're like, I wonder if that person was an activist. And I don't know if this person was or if they were just trolling this group of teenagers with gruesome videos, but I really have that stranger on the internet to thank for my vegan origin story. Like that's the opposite of how we try to get people to go vegan now, which is really funny, but it worked on me.
Wow.
So I
Yeah.
can't knock it.
Yeah. Well, I asked this to all my guests, and it's really interesting to hear what it is that gets people to go vegan. And oftentimes it's the graphic imagery or a graphic picture that is what does it. And there's this debate, right, whether we should use graphic imagery or not. But this seems to be what works for a lot of people. So
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Like it works on certain people, and I think that it tends to work. This is just, I'm not saying this from a data point of view, but just in my own experience, it seems to work for people who eventually become activists. And
mm,
it seems to not really work with people who don't really have room in their lives for some reason or another to become really active in the movement. And so I do think that it has its place. I think that it can really rile the right people up and like really encourage them to make big changes and fight really hard. But if you're not someone who tends to do those things, then it's likely not going to help you. It might even traumatize you. And so I do applaud the folks that are doing that work, helping people see that kind of visual information that really want to know what's going on. And I really think that there's a place for it in the movement for sure.
yeah, yeah, I agree. And I think for me, I think the best way to use it is if someone knows going in, like they know going in, like they make the choice to see a
Exactly.
graphic image, like just clicking on a link and not knowing. I don't know that that's where you may find those people that would be traumatized or be turned off or whatever. But I think if you know going in and you want to see and want to know, then it can be very effective.
Absolutely. I,
Yeah.
I completely agree.
So, Britty, I invited you on the podcast because you're going to be speaking at the Animal and Vegan Advocacy Summit, which is this big animal welfare conference happening in LA in late July. And this presentation you're giving is called Confronting Anti Fatness, Rethinking and Reshaping the Vegan Message. So I feel that this is a really important topic to talk about. And I'm, really glad actually to have you on and be able to talk about it again on this podcast. I had Andy Tabar in an episode a couple years ago talking about this issue. So it's been too long since we have talked about it again. So I'm I was so glad to see your presentation in the schedule. So maybe we should just start with language and what you feel is acceptable language for talking about this issue and big bodies and fatness and what are okay things and terms, and maybe also as you're doing that an overview of what the problem is.
Yeah, sure. I think that's a perfect jumping off question. There are really so many terms I think that float around this issue of how we view and treat fat people. There's fat phobia, anti-fat bias, which is mostly what I'll be talking about. People use the term thin privilege or weight shaming, sizeism, healthism. So there are literally so many terms that I think are really used interchangeably when we talk about this topic, honestly, maybe even when they shouldn't be used so
Mm.
interchangeably. So I appreciate the question. I think that I really like to mostly distinguish between fat phobia and anti-fatness. And that's because of how the term fat phobia is really thrown around. So actually, Hope, what do you think of when you hear the word phobia?
Something to be afraid of.
Yeah, so exactly. So like most people immediately jump to irrational fears, like
Yeah.
not necessarily logical fears. Like a phobia is something that you have a fear of that is uncontrollable. It often requires help from like a mental health professional to overcome or manage it.
Yeah.
And I think what we're talking about, though, just on the topic of how we treat and view fat people, is more about taking personal responsibility for how we treat each other and
Mm.
how much personal responsibility can we really take for something that happens to us versus something we ourselves are perpetuating? I think that's really the question that we have to ask ourselves when we try to distinguish between the term fat phobia and using something a little clearer like anti-fat bias. So in that spirit, I try to use the term anti fat bias, which focuses mostly on the personal attitudes and biases against fat people that are held by us as individuals. And like just like other prejudices, like anti-fat bias is something that even fat people can hold deep inside their brains, deep inside their psyches. It's something that we can act on just like the rest of society. We all possess it because of the messages that really surround us. And I think just going back to the problem at hand. So in my talk at AVA,
So when you say Ava, you're talking about the Animal and Vegan Advocacy Summit that we were just talking about.
yes, so at AVA, which is in late July in LA, I
Yeah.
think I'll be talking on a Saturday at AVA.
And what are you going to be presenting?
So I'm going to be presenting basically the evidence to show that anti-fatness has absolutely worked its way into our messaging and our marketing as a movement. And I will also show how that prevents us from growing our capacity as a movement, how that turns would-be leaders and activists off to our movement. And I'll give us a little bit of a push, a suggestion of how we can kind of correct that as we're moving forward with
Mm.
all of this kind of anti-discrimination work.
Wow. And when I learned so much when I had Andy on and we talked about this issue. And one thing that he brought to my attention, well, two things when we're talking about language is that it's okay, or he feels, and I think you do as well, that it's okay to use the term fat, to just say someone is fat. And I think that that has kind of been kind of taboo, like, oh, that's mean to say someone's fat. But there seems to be kind of an embracing of that word and term as just, that, yeah, normal fat.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And then also on the opposite, or the other side, I guess, with someone who is not fat, the term that Andy was using was straight sized people
Yes.
instead
Yeah.
of like normal or skinny. Because I mean, if you say someone's normal, then anything outside of that realm would be abnormal or not normal. So that,
Yeah.
is not cool to say. So how do you feel about straight sized as a term for not fat? Can you talk about those two terms?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So straight sized is probably the best term to use for people who are perceived as thinner or perceived as having a more acceptable body type for society's purposes. So going back to fat, I think that yes, it's completely acceptable to use fat. I use fat in my everyday language, but I use that as a fat person. So I think that when we're talking about what to call people, context just is really king. We have to make sure that who we're speaking to is completely okay with this kind of language. And just like asking people their pronouns, etc., it's really just about consent and context. For instance, with like a conversation with my mom is going to go a lot different than a conversation with a fellow activist about this issue. I think just as long as we're approaching people and their preferences and their viewpoints as valid and worthy of respect, then we're going to do the right thing. And so, like, I remember this podcast with Andy, and I remember him saying that he himself has bristled when he hears someone else calling him fat. And I actually recently had that same exact experience. I was having a conversation with someone about this issue, and they then referred to me as a fat person when talking to someone else in this same conversation. Completely acceptable, completely something that I would say about myself and that I would expect people to say. But I had those feelings come up where I was like, how dare you?
Huh.
And it comes from this messaging, though. It really comes from a deeper thing, which is something about me, meaning like the way I look, means something more about me. And so when people refer to me as a fat person, they're not just calling me fat, they're calling me lazy, or they're calling me self indulgent. And
Mm.
so I think that there's just so much reckoning we have to do with really the messages that we've sent young children, the messages we send each other when we
Wow.
talk about weight loss, dieting, etc., that just still have yet to find their place in the vernacular. And I think that if we just accept that it's very fluid and that this is a sensitive topic that people care very deeply about, no matter what side you're on, and no matter what size you're at, I think that we'll do the right thing if we really hold space for that truth.
Wow. Yeah, that's really interesting. It's almost like beyond a descriptor, if you're adding the description of someone not for purposes to point them out or find them or something like that. It's more just like who they are. And so it's in a negative way. Like you don't want to say that Jewish person over there.
Unless it's in context,
Yeah.
unless they're specifically talking about why their being Jewish really matters in the context of the conversation. And I think
Okay.
that
Yeah.
really takes us back to like what's most important about people. Like I wouldn't describe myself as a fat person unless I was talking about how being a fat person helps me exist in the world, or, hurts my existence in the world in some form or fashion. Just
Yeah.
like, in any conversation, I'm not going to necessarily introduce myself as a mother or introduce myself as a vegan, even in all situations. And so I just think context matters and sensitivity really matters. And, when you hold that truth to be really powerful, then it will come out in your language and people will understand what you mean because you're being careful and you're being considerate.
Well, I remember on Andy's episode, Andy Tabar, when he was on the podcast, he said that the only acceptable, quote unquote, acceptable fat person were those that were trying to lose the weight.
Yeah.
But if someone was presenting as just being, happy with who they were and happy with their bodies, that's not acceptable. That's not okay. What's up with that? And I was I re-listened to his podcast and really was thinking about that deeply. And of course, there's the issue that we as a society, what we value, what we feel is worthy is of course youth and being skinny. These are throughout our culture and our media and all of that. Do you think maybe that straight size society has a fear of fat bodies? Is that what's going on? What is up with that?
Yeah, I think those things are not entirely connected, but yes, I think that a everyone, straight sized or not, has a learned fear,
Mm.
not necessarily of other people's fat bodies, but of becoming fat themselves. And I
Um,
think that, when we distinguish between fat phobia and anti-fat bias, those things definitely touch. But when I think of fat phobia, I think of something deeply personal. We've all heard the, like, oh, I don't think you're fat. Or like, I'm trying to lose weight right now, but that doesn't mean that I think any less of you if you're not. Or, I think I look fat in this dress, but you look great. As a fat person, hearing that from straight sized people, it's always pretty laughable. But yeah, no, I do think that that is something that exists in most of us. If it doesn't exist in you, I think you're incredibly lucky if you don't have a fear of being fat. I think that most of us are somewhere in our mind consistently trying not to be fat. And I think that we should be talking about that more often, challenging it if we can. But yeah, I think Andy's completely right. Being a fat person who has verbalized that they're on a diet will make you like a plant-based hero in some vegan circles. Like I've personally most often seen fat people tokenized, I think, as activism success stories more often than, fat people just being celebrated in the movement for their other contributions. I do think though that there's myriad ways that fat people's bodies find shelter from judgment in our movement. Like you can be fat as long as you're an activist who is also incredibly outspoken about being fat, like me. Like, so it's okay that I'm fat because I'm having this conversation on a podcast about being fat, but it's not okay if I'm just, existing in the movement, not talking about my weight.
Hmm.
Like, you could be fat as long as this is my favorite, as long as you can prove that you're also incredibly healthy in other ways. So if I am able to show with blood tests and if I'm incredibly, active, then it's okay that I'm fat because now I have like, oh, people will see that, I'm very active and that really goes against what they view about fat people. Also, I'm a mom, so one of the things that I find is more acceptable for my fatness is that I've had a kid, and so that means that it's okay because people assume that it just wrecks your body whenever you have a kid.
Hmm.
But there are many ways to be acceptable, I think, as a fat person in the movement. And I think that the common thread here really is that fat people in our society and in our movement aren't inherently entitled to respect from others. Like we are expected to be incredibly vulnerable with our medical status, or we're expected to publicly exclaim that we're trying to not be fat before we're given the basic respect that straight sized people are given by virtue of existing. And what's not scary about that? Like, that's really scary. I don't know anyone who would choose this stigma with any kind of enthusiasm. Yeah, I think he's absolutely correct when he
Wow.
asserted that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. And you brought up actually the bias that I held before Andy and I spoke that I didn't really realize, and that is I asked him the question, you can be healthy and fat, right? I mean, people don't realize this. And, we should show that fat people can be healthy and are healthy. And, his response was like, okay, yeah, sure. But what does that matter? That shouldn't matter. That shouldn't be anyone's business. It shouldn't be, I mean, that was kind of the feeling of the response. And I was like, wow, yeah, it's really true. Our health status is really no one's business, shouldn't matter, shouldn't be part of how we perceive someone. And yeah, it was really, really an eye opener to me. Did you want to expand on that a little?
I think what you're describing is healthism. For me, healthism is like others having a right to personal information of mine or else. So it's like you are allowed to exist in this fat body. You are allowed to be fat so long as I know all these things about you that you would never ask about me. Like
Mm,
I would never assume anything about anyone's inner health. First of all, as a fat person, knowing the kind of stigma that I get, knowing the kind of questions that I've personally gotten, I would never ask that of other people. But also, healthism really exists to empower people to be able to judge others using a kind of pseudo sympathy about other people's health that I think, if challenged, we would find that that really doesn't exist. We don't really care that deeply about other people's inner health because usually we'd wait for other people to share good or bad news about their health outcomes, right? But when it comes to fat people, that is actually something we need ahead of time so that we know if we owe you respect or not.
mm,
And that kind of transaction socially does not really bode well with fat
Yeah.
people because we can see it.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't I doubt that anyone ever really thinks about that or considers that, you know, it's none of your business. And that's
Yeah.
not something we should be asking someone or talking about unless they offer that information, you know?
Yeah.
Well, so let's talk about veganism and all this and the vegan movement and this issue. And veganism, especially with the health vegans and, whole food plant based and all of that movement, healthy veganism, it's often presented as a weight loss diet and that you can lose weight and that it's good for all these issues. I mean, really, it's often presented as just a cure-all for everything from weight loss to cancer. This is all very nuanced, of course, and there is absolutely health benefits, and I'm not denying that or saying there aren't. However, I think that it can be really problematic if we go in with all these promises, just over promising, and the promises aren't fulfilled, right? When so people, go vegan and then perhaps they don't lose the weight or they don't feel great or whatever is happening. It's really I think a big problem, and that we need to be very careful with the health angle. Yes, it brings people in, but are we going to have these issues? And weight loss is a huge part of that's one of the things that gets promised. So, what do you think about all that, about the plant-based vegan community and the claims of improved health and all of that?
Yeah. So just to go back to your like what if we don't fulfill these promises? I think that from my point of view, veganism being presented as good for weight loss is in and of itself problematic, regardless, I think, of the effectiveness of the claims. And I say that because I think that weight loss, at least from my point of view, is largely a beauty trend. It's a cosmetic trend. And we know how harmful the beauty industry has been for like all people, especially women. And for me, I'm like, who are we as a movement if we exploit that harm? Like even in the name of animals, like at the end of the day, it's exploitation of a beauty trend.
Mm,
And I think just going back to what we were speaking about in regard to healthism, I think that again, when we talk about weight loss, we really need to figure out what part of weight loss we're talking about. Are we talking about weight loss so that you fit into a dress? Are you talking about weight loss so that you have higher self esteem? I do think that a lot of times when people enter into the health tunnel into veganism, the health route, that often we are talking about all of these inner benefits. I want to lower my cholesterol. I want to, stave off heart disease or not get type 2 diabetes. I think that we're talking about that a lot. But I think if we really did some investigating, the majority of these people are generally trying to do this for cosmetic reasons. I know that that's what I've always had whenever I've tried to lose weight, which has been, hundreds of times in my life.
mm,
Um, that I'll say it's for all of these internal, healthism reasons. But really, if you dig deep down into my brain, ultimately, like I can deal with medical issues, but what I can't deal with is feeling and looking bad. And I think that we are exploiting that when we talk about weight loss as the promise of veganism. So I'm not here to try and tell anyone to stop talking about the health benefits of veganism. And I agree with the inner health benefits of veganism. The data shows it. And I think what's really happening is that I and many others are trying to implore vegan organizations of all sizes to stop touting weight loss and focus instead on the diseases that plant-based eating has been proven to help mitigate, like heart disease and certain types of cancer, all of which, this is the kicker for me, all of these things are not caused by looking fat. They can be caused by eating animal products. And we have that data. And instead of tapping into that actual data, more often, I think I see larger campaigns tapping more into the societal fear of being fat And I just think that eventually we're going to have to answer for that as a movement. I,
Mm,
I think that I think that we should absolutely focus on health benefits of a plant-based diet. And I think that there are tons of people in the movement that are doing that. But I also think that it really needs to be done so conscientiously
yeah.
because it often turns people off to our movement and it doesn't attract people for the right reasons. Yes, I do agree that, like, if we say it's going to cure cancer, it better cure cancer. But there's a middle ground there where we can say, hey, look at the data. Like all of these like lower body cancers, high correlation to eating animal products. And I think that stands out on its own. And I just think that we just need to be way more conscientious about how we express that message.
Yeah, language like it reduces your risk of heart disease or reduces your risk of cancer, things like that, instead of just these sensational claims. I think
Yeah,
is,
or the weight-based claims. So like what are plant-based vegan activists trying to do? They're trying to get people to eat whole foods, plant-based diets, and they're hoping to appeal to their health outcomes. But what they're actually doing is appealing to their fear of becoming fat, and people are entering into the movement with a fear of becoming fat and having that exploited.
yeah.
I don't think that that is a sustainable way to attract activists to the movement. It's not sustainable for animals and it's not sustainable for the human beings that are hearing those messages.
Yeah, so the health issue is one thing and one way that fat bias manifests in the vegan movement. What are some other ways? What are we seeing, or what are you seeing in the movement that also creates, anti-fat bias?
Yeah, in my experience, I think that healthism certainly is an underlying factor in pretty much everything we are talking about. So that is really the overarching thing. And it's not so much that there's this, like there's a health aspect and then there's the aesthetics aspect of it and that those are separate. I think it's really just that there's this hatred of fatness
Hmm.
and a worship of thinness, and that health, it happens to just be the most convenient scapegoat
Hmm.
of those who feel empowered to affect the experience of fat people in the movement. So at the end of the day, I think that we as a society share beliefs about fat people and what it means about your personality if you're fat. And instead of owning up to those stereotypes, which I think are bigoted, we end up relying on this obscure pseudo sympathy of others' health. We know that it's nearly impossible to gauge a person's inner health by their appearance. Like we know that. And yet, as soon as we exclaim that thing that obesity is the number one killer of adults in America, I think everyone nods in agreement. Suddenly it's a-okay. And what that leads to is that it's a-okay that we just told a fat person to sit out of this protest, or we just told a fat person to stand aside for this group picture. And it becomes completely understandable that we just had this conversation about how fat people shouldn't be the poster children of the vegan movement, because you can ask other fat activists, and there is actually data to show that people are having these conversations, that they want people to want to go vegan. And if they see you, they'll think that veganism makes you fat in one way or another. I
Hmm.
think the most insidious thing that's happening right now inside the movement is this perpetuation of the idea that you have to be perfect if you're going to advocate for the lifestyle change of someone else. Like you need to look like their version of perfection, or else you need to sit back and not take part, or take part in like a
In
behind
a
the
not
scene.
not public way.
Yeah, in a not public way. And let me tell you, just from my experience and hearing the stories of others, it just takes one. Like it takes one bad experience for someone to never dip another toe into activism again, to never attend another vegan event again, if they feel that they've been at all discriminated against. Like no one wants to go where they don't feel welcome. And I think it's absurd that we sometimes place the responsibility onto fat people to overcome that discomfort if they want to make a difference for animals. We expect, fat volunteers to have to take questions from the general public who are walking up to the booth and asking about being, a vegan, and how can you be a vegan if you're fat? There's no protection for these people. And I think that we are doing a huge disservice to the movement by essentially assisting people in their exit of this movement. Like we are helping them leave and telling them
Mhm.
literally to leave. And
Wow.
that cannot be good for animals.
No. No, it's awful. It breaks my heart. And I hate even thinking about that there are people out there that want to help, that are drawn to this movement, that want to help animals, and they feel that they can't because what? Because they don't look the right way. It infuriates me. And what can we do? What can we do as a movement to curb this bias, to try to correct this complete injustice?
Well, that's a big question.
Yeah.
I think the main thing that we can do is just be hyper aware of it and to say no when we see it.
Yeah.
The biggest culprits are the organizations who are buying billboards, who are doing these massive body shaming campaigns in the name of health. And I think that if they could just stop doing that, it would be great. Also, I think that when we're talking about grassroots organizations, which are the vast majority of people doing these kinds of activism, where they have really great opportunities to pull in people from the community of all sizes. I think that when we're at these grassroots organizations, we also need to take a look at how we're treating fat activists, how we're attracting fat activists. Is your message a weight loss message? If it is, you might attract some people, but you're also going to push away some people. I do understand that it's a lot of people's method to pull in people from the community based on their wish to become healthier. And I think that if we can just hold these truths in mind, that fat people are already experiencing these biases, these well recorded terrible experiences in the workplace, in society at large, if we can really hold those truths to be relevant and to be important, then the rest will follow. I think that education is incredibly important. I think assessing and challenging your own relationship to fatness is incredibly important. Reading about this issue, it is a racial issue just as much as it is any other kind of issue. It traces its origins back to racism, essentially. And if we can just catch and correct ourselves and listen to people when they tell us that our campaigns are not working or that our campaigns are exclusionary, then we have to make changes. And I think that that's really where it starts. There is a dearth of research in the movement of how our messaging affects people in and out of the movement in larger bodies. And there's a dearth of research in all of these areas when we're talking about anti-discriminatory practices. But if we're only talking about fatness, there is very little research done about our actual capacity building, about how that has really affected the vegan movement. And
Yeah.
I think if we did research, we would see that we have really turned a lot of people off to this movement and done a dirty job for animals in the meantime.
Yeah, I'm so grateful that just now and just a little bit as a movement, we are embracing now anti-oppression work, just starting to kind of wake up to this, to the work of broader oppression, and working to improve issues of diversity and language and messaging around inclusion in what we're putting out, as well as internally. But I think this issue really is so overlooked. I don't think that people put this issue, anti-fat bias, on the same level as other oppressions, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and why do you think that is? And how does fat oppression kind of fit into the larger systematic oppressions? You were kind of talking about that, but maybe a little more about that.
Sure. Yeah. So on the specific topic of fatness, I think, and probably to put it more generally than it deserves, I think the biggest thing that prevents anti-fat bias from being taken as seriously as other forms of oppression is because people who would otherwise consider themselves allies of anti-oppression movements, I think they tend to still hold that deep belief that fatness is a choice, therefore it's deserving of judgment, and other statuses like race, gender, disability, sexual orientation to those people who would otherwise consider themselves allies are uncontrollable and therefore they're off limits to
Oh,
judgment.
huh.
So I think what that means that is that like fatness doesn't have the advocates in its corner where other groups might right now. So even if you are an advocate for people in other ways, you could still actually be going against going against fat people. And I think the irony is that anti-fat bias is also inextricably linked to these larger systems of oppression. So how we view and treat fat people is mutually reinforced and it's compounded with how we treat all other marginalized people, especially people of color and especially women.
Yeah.
Like, well, there's undeniable evidence that the historical roots of anti-fatness can be traced back to the construction of whiteness. It's of like forced European beauty standards during the slave trade, the medicalization of blackness or eugenics. Like I should mention, I'm not an expert here. There are so many writings on this topic. Honestly, like I do have book suggestions for people who want to read history for themselves, but I'd like to underline, despite the work that we've seen in the animal justice movement, I think to prioritize inclusivity and diversity, I think we still just have such a long way to go
Oh, yeah.
before we can say that we're like a truly equitable movement. And yeah, I think fat people do need protection in this movement. And we're just not protecting them as a class of people in the same or with the same ferocity as we are in other areas, but that these areas are all linked together. And so when we do fight for these other things, it doesn't mean that fatness is off the table. And conversely, when we fight against anti fat bias, we are fighting for these other forms of discrimination as well. And so I think that as we do this more, we will see more. So it doesn't detract from one or the other to fight for people in certain classes and in certain situations. So I think that they all are linked together, but that we're just now kind of figuring out, oh crap, there's fat people too in this movement and they have feelings about it.
Yeah, well, all really, really important points and great stuff to talk about. I mean, I think that's just part of it is talking about it. I don't think people are uncomfortable to talk about it, and so we have to break through that and say no, it's important to talk about.
Yeah.
So something happened recently that was definitely a step in the right direction. The American Medical Association voted to make this policy change around BMI, body mass index. And they're now recommending to doctors to de emphasize BMI when assessing overall health. And they actually acknowledged the quote historical harm that BMI has done. And I wonder if you want to talk about this. Can you first maybe just define BMI for us and kind of, what it is and how it fits in to what we're talking about and talk about this new development?
Yeah, so it's a really great development. I think it's incredibly symbolic. Party hands to the AMA. I yeah, so just body mass index is the most commonly used tool in the medical profession to assess obesity. It's basically a height to weight ratio. How tall are you? That's how heavy you should be, and any higher than that, you get on this scale of obesity. So it's it starts with overweight and then it goes to obese, then morbidly obese. There's lots of little categories in here and you can go below it too. So you could be underweight. But BMI, you know, this is it feels so silly to talk about because it's such a silly measurement. And even the person who invented BMI came out and was like, no, don't use it. So it
Really?
really isn't. Yeah, oh yeah. It's very ironic, I think, that we're still using BMI. But the truth is that like it's really, really hard to measure health. it takes a lot of money to do that, a lot of resources. And so I think that doctors have really relied on BMI as just this kind of catch-all, like, mostly it's visual when you really think about it. Like, you go into your PCP, your primary care physician's office, and if you're having any kind of ailment, it's like, well, what have you tried? Obviously, you're fat. You should try to lose weight. That might help a little bit. That's the general experience of any fat person. But
Yeah.
what we know is that the body mass index does not measure health. It does not measure attractiveness. It doesn't measure fatness. And like when it comes to disease, the way your body looks is just simply, it's not a strong determiner of your health. And that is the medical opinion, is that the way your body looks is not a strong determiner of your health. So blaming obesity outright for diseases, obviously, as we've talked about, it ignores all these other things. It ignores bigger risk factors like smoking or the consumption of animal products.
Yeah.
And I'm incredibly happy that the AMA, the American Medical Association, has at least somewhat symbolically, like, dropped a ladder down into the hole that BMI's created. And so
Mm.
it's my hope that, like, actual family doctors will follow suit, because these kind of microaggressions on fat people are really the thing that prevents a lot of fat people from going to the doctor. Like, doctors are humans too, and like we all have this experience of going to the doctor as vegans and having them ignore medical facts when it comes to the vegan diet. And they can also hold anti-fat biases just like the rest of us, and it negatively impacts their patients. And so it's my hope with this new measure that it's taken very seriously. And I know it is mostly symbolic. There's no real prevention here from, your family doctor still kind of going a little off the rails with BMI and its importance. But I do think that this is the start of something really good. And it's at least the start of this conversation of, is obesity a risk factor, or is obesity a disease? And I think that is a really big question for other people who are way bigger professionals than I am to address. But that is kind of the topic of the moment: is fatness a disease, or is fatness a status? And is fatness a risk factor, just like poverty is a risk factor, just like where you live is a risk factor? Like, do we really have the right to look at someone who's fat and assess their health with no other measurements? And like, obviously, as humans, we would say no, but that's not the truth when it comes to doctors. Like, it really is as simple as weight and height ratio. And I'm happy to see that changing.
Yeah, and wasn't BMI, it was like the chart was invented around like European white males.
Yes, hyper specific. Yeah.
Yeah, and nothing else, no other factors, no other ethnicities, no other, anything, genders was brought in. I think now they do have male and female, but still, it's so general.
Yeah,
Uh,
like, even if Noah's arked this thing and got everybody in twos, and measured BMI based on everybody's physical characteristics otherwise, it would still be problematic, because height to weight ratio is not an assessor of health.
yeah,
And it's
yeah,
still
and
just
then
a tool that is like improperly used, and also used to weaponize against fat people,
mm,
often to their own detriment. Like, there are so many studies that show how surgeons, how family medical doctors have these biases that literally endanger the lives of fat people when they go under the knife, when they're being looked at for certain cancers. A lot of stuff gets overlooked because adipose tissue, fat tissue, is often confused. When you might have a tumor, your doctor might think that you're just fat. And those
mhm.
are really, like, complicated, scary things that are happening with medical doctors that should be addressed, and that I hope that this is a start of addressing.
So, changing the topic a little bit, I did want to ask you about discrimination and this issue. And I really don't think that straight-sized people realize the kind of discrimination that large people can face, like the pay gap, that people are paid on average less than people that weigh less. What are some other ways that fat people are discriminated against?
Yeah. So I guess to touch on what I said earlier, what we talked about earlier, being fat means something about you. It's really not that you are fat and therefore it is wrong. It really, it means something about you. And just like any other prejudice, I think the list can be, as long as you want when it comes to what we believe about fat people. So a couple of years ago, there was a study that evaluated different aspects of weight bias in the workplace. When they did the results, they found that I think since 2010, I think the study was from 2010 to 2021, and regarding biases of sexuality, ethnicity, like skin color, age, disability, those over time decreased. So it resulted in like more positive workplace experiences by people in those certain oppressed groups. So if you're someone who in 2010 was experiencing biases regarding your sexuality or your ethnicity, it got better by 2021. So, we're on the up on these. Like we're doing a slightly better job. Like people feel a little bit happier in the workplace, but it did not show that same positive trajectory for fat people. According to the studies, it actually got worse between 2010 and 2021 for fat people.
Wow.
So that's why it's really interesting about what you were saying when they compared people in thinner bodies who performed the same amount of the same type of work in equivalent positions. Fat people on average made about 10% less. And if you're a fat woman, you made around 11.2% less, which tracks because, women. And they also found that fat people were regarded by their employers as having higher levels of incompetence, emotionality, and self indulgence. So they're more incompetent, more emotional, more self indulgent.
Wow.
That like tracked through all of the research. So when
Mm.
an employee would noticeably gain weight, they received lower marks on their annual reviews in the areas of motivation and competence. And conversely, if your supervisor saw that you as a fat employee had lost weight, they would mark you as having improved in terms of self-control,
Oh,
competence, and ability simply
wow.
by becoming a smaller person. You are more
Oh.
competent and better at your job. This was a multi-years long study, and
Wow.
that is true. Like like as a fat person, that tracks. Like I feel that way about myself.
Mm.
We attribute so much of like, weight loss, going on this weight loss journey must mean that you're, incredible, you have an incredible willpower and you're like overcoming adversity, when in fact like maybe you were depressed and didn't eat, or like maybe you weren't taking care of yourself, or maybe you gained an eating disorder. Like things happen, but
Yeah.
we as a society really attribute like some heroic stuff to people who lose weight, and some really the opposite of heroic stuff to people who gain weight, regardless of why. And so, like, there are so many studies that show that fat people are receiving discrimination. And in fact, I think I don't mean to quote anybody here because I don't have the original quote with me, but I remember reading something where someone was saying that fatness, like fat phobia, anti-fat bias, is one of the last remaining discriminatory practices where people feel empowered to do it openly. So
Mm.
people feel empowered, I think, by the healthism scapegoat to remark on people's body sizes, to assume things about their health openly,
Yeah.
whereas these other isms are no longer at least openly allowed. That for better or worse, like it's
Yeah.
terrible to talk about like discrimination, period. It's a really tough subject, but people, even those who would consider themselves allies in all of these other anti-discriminatory movements, are not allies of fat people, and they feel entitled to speak quite harshly about fat people and what it means to be a fat person. And so we have a harder hill to climb, I think, on fatness in that regard.
Wow. Wow, that was all really just shocking and terrible. And and to me, what I come to is compassion. And as, a vegan, as a compassionate person, just have compassion, don't I don't know, it's wow. But I think that a lot of it is unconscious. Like I
Yeah.
do. I mean, I don't think that I think of course there's people that are, mean and horrible and are gonna say stupid, mean things. But I think that a lot of it is unconscious. Like we just don't realize that we have this kind of bias, like those, like the job performance stuff, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, I'll bet you anything you ask that boss or you show them that data and they'd be like, no, no, it doesn't have anything to do with that. Like, well, you
Yeah.
know, it's there, right? So important for us to like be aware of these things. And then once you are aware, have compassion and realize that this is an oppression.
Yeah, no, I think that's the kicker, right? Is that it is so unconscious. And the problem too with anti-fatness in general and fat phobia on a more personal level, I think is even once you do become aware of those feelings, it's so hard to get rid of them. Like I've gone through therapy for years and years to try and combat this, and I still have that little voice inside my head that goes like, maybe tomorrow, we can start a diet, or oh, you better, work off those calories that you ate. Like that voice still exists in my mind. And we still have the whole thing to fight against with healthism, where we have to really look at ourselves and figure out like where these motivations are coming from. It's just so hard to remove it from ourselves and then to turn around and try to remove it from the systems that we're a part of, especially where we have very little control. And so I mean, honestly, that's why I'm giving this talk at Ava, because I really need that audience of people who have the power to change policy. And we can only do so much internally and in our own lives. And we can only talk about it so much if it's still built into the systems and rewarded.
Well, Brittany, before we let you go, I do want to ask you about your organization. You have a fantastic organization called Planted Society. Tell us what it is and what you do.
Yeah, so I'm the founder and executive director of a nonprofit called Planet Society. We've been around since 2016. And before this initiative that I'll talk about in a second, we worked just one on one with restaurants. So, one at a time, we helped them add more plant-based options. We even got 5 restaurants to go completely vegan. But our
Wow.
main,
Where is
yeah,
this? What in what area?
so we started as ATX Vegans. ATX is the abbreviation that people give Austin, Texas, just like
Oh,
PDX for Portland.
right.
And so we started as ATX Vegans, and we were just a grassroots organization that did like parties and meetups and potlucks and things like that. And we branched out to start working with restaurants because we were looking for opportunities with bigger spaces. Our crowd was getting bigger. From ATX Vegans, I'm a supply chain engineer by trade, and I wanted to work with restaurants who were not vegan, to get them to have more plant-based options, mostly just because we needed more places to go to have fun with our vegan friends. And when I say have fun with our vegan friends, it's like 50 to 150 people at a time. And so we needed bigger spaces. And luckily, I was able to convince a couple of restaurants to work with us. And I helped them, with their menu sets, add on new plant-based menu items permanently, some of them just temporarily in, the hopes that they would be inspired by our big crowd to add more plant-based products to their permanent menu, and they did. So I came up with Planted Society because I wanted to really take that on the road. I didn't just want it to be associated with Austin, and we've now been in 7 cities, and it's been really awesome. Basically, now our main program is called Plant Based for the Planet, and that is a month-long city-sponsored dining initiative where we actually help communities as a whole lower their climate impact by choosing plant-based options when they dine out for that month. So we try and partner with about 15 locally owned restaurants at a time. And each of those restaurants, the chefs there, the managers and owners, they submit a couple of new plant-based specials just for the month. So, as a whole community, we try to see how many greenhouse gases, water, and land we can save by leaving animals off our plates. And we want to continue bringing this program to cities around the country. Right now, we are trying to just build that blueprint in Texas. We've done it once in a small town called Montclair, New Jersey, but it was highly successful there. And we plan on just bringing it to different cities as the programming really kind of perfects itself.
That's really great work. The organization is Planted Society, and we'll have a link to their information in the show notes if you want to learn more. So, we always ask this question at the end of all our guests. So, I will ask you, what gives you hope for the future?
What gives me hope for the future is just seeing how I think we're finally, as a movement, moving more in the direction of inclusive campaigns that involve so many more stakeholders than just the vegan activists and like our audience of non-vegans. And
Yeah.
I'm seeing this, yeah, no, I'm seeing this amazing redirection of partnerships that are really bridging gaps between issues that are happening in communities. And I'm seeing organizations who would, I think, in the past consider their missions to be completely separate from one another, actually engage with and partner with each other to like leverage their networks and activists in a way that I think has the potential to really rapidly increase our capacity. And I think now that I say that, I think the warning that I would give myself and other activists is that if we're opening our doors, our rooms better be clean and tidy. I think like this movement that we're opening up, essentially, we're capacity building. And like any movement, like we have skeletons in our closet and we have messes to clean up and habits that need to change. And I'm really happy to see that we're becoming more aware of that. And I think the promise that I see really lives where people are giving people resources to change their communities from the inside out and not just from the outside in. I'm really happy to see that we're looking now internally at our systems and habits and processes inside the animal justice movement so that while we're opening that capacity and pulling so many more stakeholders in, non-vegans included, policymakers included, that we are really looking at ourselves to make sure that our movement is hospitable to those newcomers. And that really gives me hope.
Well, I really look forward to meeting you down at the Animals and Vegan Advocacy Summit, where you will be speaking on this subject that we have been talking about. I appreciate that you are speaking about this issue. I feel it's very important, needs to be talked about more, and I recognize that it can be very vulnerable. I would think to do this work and to talk about these things. So, thank you very, very much for doing this.
Thank you for giving me a platform to do it. I really appreciate it. And I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you for listening to the Hope for the Animals podcast, a project of compassionate living. If you found this episode informative, please help us to get the word out to others and share it with your networks. If you're listening on the podcast app, please remember always after you've listened to an episode, scroll down, find those ratings, those stars, and give us a 5-star rating. Maybe write a review. That is so helpful in widening our reach. If you are going to the Animal and Vegan Advocacy Summit in LA, that's July 27th to 31st, 2023, be sure to stop by our Compassionate Living table and let me know that you listen to the podcast. I love meeting podcast listeners. We have a new logo for the podcast that we are kind of slowly incorporating, slowly rolling out, but we're going to have some fun stickers with our new podcast logo there at the table. So please stop by and say hello. And remember, have compassion for everyone, all animals and all humans alike, and live vegan.